We hear phrases all the time like climate breakdown or ecological breakdown. What you have to understand is that the conditions on Earth have always changed throughout the history of the planet. The crucial thing that we need to be concerned about is the fact that there's a set of conditions that are optimal for us humans. That's why we're concerned about climate change. That's why we're concerned about biodiversity, not biodiversity loss and all these other issues. Because if we disrupt those conditions too much, it may undermine the ecosystem services upon which we depend.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
Leigh Phillips is a science writer and a political journalist. His work has appeared in Nature, The New Scientist, Science, The Guardian, The Daily Telegraph, The New Republic, and Jacobin, among other outlets. He is the author of The People's Republic of Walmart, while Matt Huber is a professor of geography at Syracuse University, and his latest book is Climate Change as Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Planet. The two of you together wrote an essay for Jacobin entitled Kohei Saito's Start from Scratch, Degrowth Communism, and that's what we'll be discussing today. So thank you both for coming on to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's just start with who Kohei Saito is and what is degrowth communism. And I'll let you guys decide who goes first.
Matt, you want to do that?
Sure. I mean, he's a philosopher who did his studies in, as far as I know, Germany, and really became invested in a large cadre of researchers that are really diving deep into Marx's notebooks and letters. And there's this kind of big project of kind of really finalizing all the manuscripts. And out of that process, he produced a book called Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism that won the Isaac Deutscher Prize and, focused on, there it is. So the basic argument, sort of looking through these notebooks, is that Marx really became more concerned with ecology late in his career, and in particular, kind of through his study of chemistry and soil science and Justice Liebig, started to really become less optimistic about the capacity of technology and the productive forces to supersede the limits of the soil and the land and agriculture. And so that book really argues that Marx sort of discovers natural limits through the study of Liebig. And in any event, that book won this big Marxist prize, the Isaac Deutscher Prize, 2018. And he went on to produce two new books, which we review in the article. One is called Marx and the Anthropocene, which is way more of an academic book. The other one was called Capital in the Anthropocene, and was published in Japan and sold 500,000 copies. And it really kind of made a huge splash in Japan, which created a lot of buzz in advance of the Marx and the Anthropocene book, which came out in 2022. And then the bestseller was finally translated into English this year as it's called Slow Down. But in any event, in these latter two books, he kind of really shifts the argument that not only did Marx become ecologically aware and sort of integrate ecology into his political economy, that he became a degrowth communist, that through his studies of agricultural communes in Russia and his correspondence with Zasulich and the Russian populist movement, that he really sort of came to this view that actually the sort of stagnant, stationary nature of these communes could be kind of a premise for communism, and that the sort of steady state economy that they represented would be something that could become the basis for a communist future. And so that allows Saito to kind of link Marx's thought to what is very popular in academia today, which is this fixation on degrowth and the kind of critique of capitalist growth fetishism and GDP and all the problems with GDP and all this stuff. And so he kind of hitches Marx to that degrowth wagon is how I would say it. There's probably a lot more I could say, but I'll stop there.
Well, I mean, I'm just going to say that doesn't sound like the Karl Marx that I'm familiar with.
I mean, I just wanted to add a couple things to what Matt had said there in terms of an introduction to Kohei Saito's work. In Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, his first one, the one that won the Deutsche Prize, he sort of articulates a trifold trajectory to approach towards Marx and ecology. That is to say that in the 1970s and traditionally, environmentalists or those environmentally minded would have written off Marxism, written it off out of hand because of the presumption that Marxism is the correct presumption, I think, that Marxism is Promethean, that it's productivist, that it wants to unfetter the forces of production. And so Marxism is just rejected as in any way environmentally minded. And then you have in the sort of the 80s and 90s, you have figures like John Bellamy Foster, Michael Lowy, a few other figures who try to say, oh, no. I'm sure there's a productivist aspect to Marxism, but also if you look at a few, notebooks and some marginalia in those notebooks and a few footnotes in Capital, that you'll actually find that there's this metabolic rift theory, that Marx had a theory of metabolic rift. And then sort of Saito argues that there's he goes all the way with respect to Marx and ecology and say it isn't merely that Marx had some aspects of his thought that were ecologically minded, but is it the totality of his thought is ecologically minded, and they did an epistemic break basically late in his career, akin to the sort of the break that Althusser talks about, where he basically rejects entirely. Marx supposedly rejects entirely the conception of the need to unfetter the forces of production. He suddenly overturns his previous embrace of and marveling at the wonders of capitalism, and now he with respect to the maybe we can get to this in a little bit, but the correspondence with Vera Zasulich, this populist in Russia, it is now the idea is that one can move directly to communism without having to pass through capitalism or even capitalist technologies, that the Mir, these communists, these Russian communes, are communism in embryo, and they can that structure can move directly to full communism.
Yeah.
It's quite a radical break with I mean, what most people would understand to be Marxism, in whichever of these three sort of analyses one has of Marxism, whether there was nothing there that was ecologically minded, there was a little bit that was, or in Saito's reading, it's all there, but there's this radical epistemic break late in his life.
What is John Bellamy Foster's notion of the metabolic rift, and where does it come from within Marx's theory, And how should we understand the notion of metabolism ecologically? Matt.
Well, quickly, I think Leigh can speak to the real science of metabolism and how Leibig kind of took up this idea. But Leigh just mentioned it, but very basically, in volume 3, Marx mentions that capital tends to produce what he called an irreparable rift between its capacity for production and the capacity of the soil to basically absorb the waste from production. Essentially, it's about the way in which capitalism causes urbanization. More people are moving to the cities, and the waste that they produce are in a sort of more natural society would be replenished through the soil and allow the soil to replenish and regrow. But because all the people now are in the cities, all this waste gets dumped into rivers and causes a lot of pollution. And there's this kind of, and then the countryside, it does not have the nutrients from that waste to kind of replenish their the soil fertility and so forth. And this is literally one quote in volume 3, deep in volume 3, that mentions this irreparable rift. To be fair, Marx in volume 1 and through much of his work is very invested in talking about the metabolism between society and nature. And I believe his conception of his historical materialist conception of the labor process is very much a metabolic conception of how labor interchanges with the natural world and produces the material basis of life and society. But in terms of this rift idea, it's literally just mentioned once. And so but this rift idea kind of becomes a platform through which a lot of ecological, John Bellamy Foster and Paul Burkett and then Saito use it to be like the ecological truth of Marx that he discovered. Like this is this ecological theory of capitalism. I happen to think that there's a lot that we can read into Marx's more straightforward theories of exploitation and surplus value and class struggle that we can just sort of, those are already pretty ecological to me. We can explain ecological degradation through those more basic theories, but they have kind of said, no, like if we want to discover, Foster's book, it's called Marx's Ecology. If we want to discover Marx's ecology, we have to discover this theory buried deep in volume 3 in many notebooks and sort of build up from there. And that's, but again, I think Leigh can expand on the whole idea of metabolism and metabolic rift.
Yeah, sure. So, metabolism is a term taken from biochemistry, and Joseph Liebig, he is sort of the founder of biochemistry and much of agronomic science as well. Metabolism is a term that describes the either the building up of new molecules within an organism's body, or the breakdown of those molecules through chemical reactions. So the building up of them is called an anabolism. You would recognize the root of that word when you think about anabolic steroids. So building up. So that's anabolism. You're taking different elements or other molecules and making new molecules, larger molecules. And catabolism is breaking those apart. And these are the two sort of types of chemical processes in an organism. And collectively, anabolism and catabolism are described as metabolism, the whole thing. It does not mean flows of energy or resources. So it is true that Marx uses this term metabolism in these notes, and we need to stress that it's just like one or two or three little notes, little marginalia. There's no sort of, I would say that Marx didn't have a theory of metabolic rift. John Bellamy Foster has a theory that Marx had a theory of metabolic rift. But if we sort of think about metabolism as a metaphor for flows of energy and resources, then okay, maybe you can forgive this a little bit more. But what Liebig is really talking about here is these flows, and he's not talking. And sorry, one last thing that metabolism is something that happens internally to an organism. It doesn't happen within an ecosystem, because an ecosystem isn't an organism. So just from a biochemical perspective, it's a little bit frustrating, like using this term. It's broadly incorrect, but okay, if you squint, you can basically accept it as a sort of metaphor. What Liebig was talking about with respect to what he called theft from the soil, and that is the sort of phrasing that Marx sort of jumps on, and rightly so, is that Liebig discovers that there is that for plants to grow, they need nitrogen. Turns out there's a few other elements that are necessary as well, but this is sort of the limiting condition for them. 70% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, but most plants can't just take that nitrogen and use it for the construction of leaves and branches and stems and so on and so forth, or anything else in their body. There has to be, because the nitrogen. I'm not going in too deep here.
No, keep going.
Okay. Basically, so molecular nitrogen, so two nitrogen atoms are triple bonded, which makes it incredibly hard to break them apart. Mm-hmm. There are some plants that can do this, but there are also bacteria that can do that. It's incredibly energetically intensive for this to happen. Though that nitrogen is used in all sorts of really, really important processes in plants, and then also that's how we get nitrogen, because all animals use nitrogen as well for in nucleic acids and in all the proteins that make up all the tissues in our body as well. So it's really essential for life. But what happens when animals, including humans, eat those plants? We've taken those nutrients, that nitrogen and the other nutrients, and then we poop and piss them out. Yes. Now, traditionally, like
on a good day, I poop them out. Sometimes it takes a long time.
Now, that's a metabolic rift right there.
Now, in a feudal society, that poop and that piss is going to be gathered up and returned to the fields, and so there's a sort of circular flow there.
Right.
When you have the building up of metropolises, and so this is a unique to capitalism. This also happened within sort of ancient Rome as well, and any other place where there's a sort of a geographic, spatial disconnect between where the food is produced and where some people or concentrations of people live or are collected. So if you take from when you shit this out, so poop this out. Sorry, I'm not supposed to say that, I guess, on YouTube. When you poop and piss this out, pee this out, wee this out, is piss allowed?
Yeah, you know what? Go for it. We're well in now, so as long as it's not in the first 10 minutes.
In for a penny, in for a pound. When you shit and piss that out, if that goes out through your sewers, Rome had sewers as well, and if it's flushed out into the rivers and then into the ocean, then that nitrogen, those nutrients, are not being returned to the soil. So that's what Liebig basically discovered. Nobody's sort of known this before. They knew that if you farm and you farm and you farm and you don't replenish the soil with muck, then the soil fertility is lost or declines. And Liebig basically discovers why this is. So that is a rift, but that's in terms of this flow of nutrients, this cycle of nutrients. But it can be fixed fairly straightforwardly if you just either you collect up that poop and you put it back in the fields, or you create you gather fertilizer from some other location. So you've probably heard before about the guano wars in the late 19th century. Or you invent a process where you can create fertilizer directly, and that's what happens in the early 19th century. So early 20th century, and now that's very carbon intensive as a result of the use of natural gas for that. That's another question that's related to climate change. In terms of just soil fertility, there is a technological sort of solution to this. But I guess just to underscore the matter here, this idea of a rift is real, but it's a spatial, it's a geographic thing. It's not to do with capitalism. Now, where
I want to jump in and just add an anecdote.
Sure.
About a decade ago, a little more than a decade ago, I took my then kids, they're all adults now, sad, but to the sewage treatment plant in town, because I wanted them to know how things worked in the world, and I was taken on a tour. It was one of the more interesting field trips we've ever taken. It's something memorable. And they showed us, from a distance, how the sewage was transformed into other gas. Actually, they use for energy, I think, and also fertilizer. And I was told this will after we treat it, this will be taken out to rural Oregon to be used as fertilizer. So not only are we cleaning the water, we're replenishing the land. And so I don't know how efficient that all is, but it seemed like it was at least an attempt to overcome the metabolic rift that you're describing. So
this is where it really gets interesting from a classical Marxist perspective, is that there's already lots of great explanations without having to add anything extra as to why that might be a problem within capitalism. That is to say, if that process of reclamation of nutrients is profitable, it will be done. So the rift will be healed if it's profitable. If it's not profitable, or even if it's not profitable enough, then it won't happen. And then what I'm guessing is that sewage treatment plant is probably publicly owned. And that's it.
Yes. And we got a big lecture about how important it was that it was publicly owned and how he'd worked at privately owned sewage treatment facilities, and they were not well run, and they didn't do an adequate job. And he was very proud to be a sewage treatment worker because he knew his work really had a direct effect on his community, and it was doing something good. And also it was a very complex, highly skilled job. It was not easy, and it required a lot of technical know-how and monitoring and real commitment from the workers who were there, and a willingness to smell shit all the time, which I think also makes it, they were noble men who were working that, and women who were working in that sewage treatment plant.
They called it sewer socialism in the early 20th century because, they realized there's things that need to be run publicly for the public good and that aren't profitable, right? One thing quickly I could add to what Leigh was saying was, in this award prize-winning book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, where he studies how Marx discovers these limits to agriculture in terms of nitrogen and the soil robbery. Unless I missed it, literally not once in the book does he mention that those limits were superseded by the discovery of synthetic chemical nitrogen by the Haber-Bosch process, a mere decades after Marx was alive, right? And so
by Liebig himself. Not Liebig, by the Haber process.
Yeah,
but
Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch. Yeah. And so like these limits that Marx started to worry about, capitalism found a technological solution to. And, the 20th century, some have called that the most profound invention of the 20th century. It really dramatically transformed our food system and our capacity for food production. And so those are the limits that Saito makes a lot of.
All right. Well, so we've kind of poked a hole in all of this already, right? I mean, the foundational thought was that there's some sort of intrinsic metabolic rift that capitalism produces, and it gets us all out of step with nature. But what we're talking about in reality was a real form of robbery from the soil due to urban density and dislocation from food production and the population, that then was overcome in various ways technologically, and even without that you could make attempts to gather up the human shit and take it out into the fields. I mean, at the very basic level. So, and yet it seems like the metabolic rift idea grew beyond that literal example. So how did that happen?
So Foster is sort of pushing. I wouldn't say that Foster, at least when he comes up with this conception of the metabolic rift theory, that he's a degrowther, but he does sort of lean into a sort of Malthusian perspective, in the sense that for him, the driver of the supposed metabolic rift is the demand, the requirement for accumulation. Growth. Now, but accumulation is also, you can read it another way with respect to what we were just talking about, insofar as if something is if a repairing of that rift is profitable, it will be done, and repairing of it did turn out to be profitable, and so it was done. If it isn't profitable, it won't be done. So that's more. It's more a problem with markets and the commodity form itself, rather than growth. That is the driver there. And so again, this returns to what we were saying earlier, that there's already, like in the first chapter of Capital, you've got an explanation already in terms of the commodity. Why does Marx start with a commodity? It's a base unit of capitalism. This is all that we need already to explain why, not just with respect to soil, but any environmental problem, or in fact any problem at all that we might face. Doesn't have to be environmental. If we discover that there is some sort of problem in society as a result of some process or technology that we're using or doing, if it continues to be profitable to produce the commodity that results in that harmful result, then the producers of that commodity, the private producers of that commodity, have an interest in maintaining the production of that commodity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like lawn darts, right? I mean, lawn darts aren't environmental. Put a hole in your head, though, if you use them, but they'll keep being made as long as people will buy them.
And the reverse is also true, that if we know something to be beneficial but isn't profitable or isn't profitable enough, then that commodity will not be, that good or service will not be produced. I mean, you talk about lawn darts from the other example, but the example that we use in the article is antibiotic resistance. For about 45 years now, large pharmaceutical companies have largely got out of the business of engaging in any sort of research and development and production of new classes of antibiotics because it's insufficiently profitable. So that's a good that is that we know to be beneficial as opposed to harmful, but there's no incentive for private actors to produce that. And so the state has to intervene to try to ameliorate that situation. So with respect to any sort of environmental problem, we've got these two aspects. So let's talk about climate change. Why is it that Exxon, BP, Shell, and so on and so forth are so reluctant to reduce and to limit the production of that commodity? Because if that commodity production is delimited, they will not be making money. So they have an incentive to, one, to continue to produce the commodity, two, to engage in legislative capture, regulatory capture, three, even in the case of Volkswagen, to be sure they don't produce the fossil fuel, but they're vehicles use fossil fuels, to actually engage in criminal activity. This is the Dieselgate that people will be familiar with from a few years ago. So we've already got all sorts of great explanations as to why we are delayed in our reduction of the use of fossil fuels. We don't need to embrace this sort of neo-Malthusian explanation that is a sort of carbuncle we sort of like try to hammer into Marxism through Foster, and then even in a more serious way with Saito.
So do they claim that there's no alternatives to fossil fuels? That the reason we haven't broken away from fossil fuels, that just at the level of production we have, couldn't be sustained in some other way?
Matt, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I wanted to add one quick thing. I know this, but just to add another big problem with the degrowth perspective is they are really fixated on how in capitalism we have this kind of ideology of growth that is fixated on GDP growth, which is really just linking to what Leigh said about commodities. It's focusing on exchange value, and it adds up. It's sort of Keynesian statistical approximation of all the different exchanges in the whole economy. And what critics of GDP growth will point out is that it doesn't care if the exchange value going up is socially useful or destructive, right? So if you're building childcare centers, GDP go up. If you're building weapons factories, GDP go up. It's just sort of indifferent. And so socialists would have we would share with degrowthers a critique of this insane and irrational kind of measure of economic health that doesn't differentiate between good, useful production and socially destructive production. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, degrowthers take that critique and just say, well, we want the opposite of GDP growth. We want degrowth, right? We want to decrease. But of course, the socialist answer is no, we want to grow socially useful production. We want to degrow things like fossil fuels that we don't need. And it's going to be about organizing production towards use value, not towards exchange value. And that's sort of a qualitative transformation of our production system. And it really doesn't have to do with this sort of quantitative obsession with growth or degrowth or whatever. But to the question of fossil fuels, and they tend to really have a very narrow technical vision of how we could replace fossil fuels, which is essentially, like most people today, they just think we're going to shift to renewables, which tends to mean basically solar and wind farms. And given that is a technically hard transition to do, they couple this vision with a imperative that alongside this shift to solar and wind, we must degrow energy consumption. We must reduce energy consumption, particularly in the global north. And so there's sort of like a fixation on energy consumption reductions and very narrow technical vision of solar and wind. Now, our perspective is that, if you really look at the modeling about what is required for decarbonization, most people agree that we're not going to be able to do it with just solar and wind farms. It's going to be a much broader suite of technologies, including nuclear power, there's probably going to have to be some carbon capture involved. There's probably going to have to be hydrogen and all these different technologies. And by the way, as we talk about in the piece, unions, industrial workers that are in these sectors tend to have this much more broader, technologically flexible vision of decarbonization, and that Saito in the book Slow Down, he has whole sections on how nuclear power is terrible and how carbon capture is a techno fix that won't do anything, and so it's sort of wild. The most radical environmentalists sort of end up sort of becoming like, they're kind of like denying what the science is saying in terms of like what is required for decarbonization. It's going to be a broad suite of technologies. And they're like, no, we only like these technologies, right? And by the way, the other thing we really like is this idea that we should all be more efficient and slow down and scale down our energy consumption. So it's coupled with what I've called it like politics of less, like, particularly global north people, you really need to consume less and you need to not be so wasteful. But our point is that, it's not a quantitative question. If we were to decarbonize our energy system with this broad suite of technologies, including nuclear power, the question of how much energy we consume would then become up to us. We can democratically debate how much energy do we need as a society, because we've solved the climate change problem. Now we need to decide what is a good amount of energy for a good life, for a communist future, and things like this. And so the way in which the degrowthers sort of bring in this kind of automatic scarcity and limits about how much energy we can have or consume, I think is sort of hardwired into their vision, which we argue is sort of ultimately linked to kind of Malthusian ideas of strict fixed limits that will inhibit our future capacities under socialism.
Yeah, so they would also, even though generally they seem to be in favor of solar and wind, even with those technologies, they want hard limits even to that, and they're very anti what they call extractivist, i.e. anti-mining, because they assume that mining is in all cases environmentally destructive and harmful to workers and communities, and health and safety standards are always terrible. So increasingly, they will take a position that even wind and solar, even though they support wind and solar, that there are limits to wind and solar, whereas we would say once you have clean electricity, with respect, so wind, solar, geothermal, particular advanced geothermal,
yes,
nuclear, hydroelectricity. Once you've got all of those, doesn't matter how much energy you're using. Also, it's not merely you serve electricity. You have to serve. There are a series of processes that are not electrifiable. Mm-hmm. And for those, we will probably need some sort of clean fuels. But those clean fuels will be produced by clean electricity. Once everything's cleaned up, you're fine. There's why do you need to have any limits with respect to climate change? Why do you need to have any limits on the amount of energy you use?
Well, it sounds to me, I agree with, most of what you're saying. I think there's always room for debates about I've heard Michael Schellenberger, who is, I know, not to be listened to, say, wind is more environmentally destructive than nuclear, and maybe wind would have limits.
Michael Schellenberger.
What do you think of Michael Schellenberger? You don't like him, huh? So tell me what's wrong with Schellenberger's ideas about wind.
So he's a disaster. My God, So Michael Schellenberger and Ted Nordhaus were the two main figures. There's a few other ones, people like Mark Linus and some others, who were basically the founders of what has become a sort of new set of ideas, a school of thought called eco-modernism. Mm-hmm. In 2014, I think the Eco-Modernist Manifesto came out. Mm-hmm. But some of their ideas they trailed that earlier, and I think it's now 20 years ago that there was an earlier book, The Death of Environmentalism, that the two of them, Nordhaus and Schellenberger, wrote, came out. And they were a perfect, I would say, to be clear, to put my cards on the table, I am friends with Ted Nordhaus. I know Mike Schellenberger very well. And I've been invited to speak at the Breakthrough Institute's dialogue on a number of occasions. I think they do incredible research. But a few years ago, there was a real bust-up between Mike Schellenberger and Ted Nordhaus and other figures. And I have no idea what the details are, but we've seen where it's gone since then, where I think that the Breakthrough Institute, Ted Nordhaus, and the whole crew continue to produce absolutely amazing research, some of the best research with respect to climate change, clean transition technologies, broader issues with respect to agriculture and land use change and biodiversity loss, and so on and so forth. Whereas Mike has, when he left the Breakthrough Institute, not in an amicable way, it seems, he went off, he galloped off in a sort of audience capture way, where he just went further and further to the right, and now his audience is a sort of the populist right, sort of Trumpian figures, where he's now even cheering on natural gas. It's not merely a matter of like saying, like, actually what we've talked to, what like the Green Left's positions on nuclear is just evidentially false, which is true. But now he's even sort of embracing that we don't need wind and solar, we just need nuclear and natural gas. And I mean, this is on. I wouldn't say he's climate denialist, but at the point where you're saying, like, if the argument were simply that we needed natural gas to replace coal, and natural gas was a bridging fuel to cleaner technologies in some geographic locations, then that would be fine to say. In fact, that's true about the United States. The major technology that allowed most of the United States to get off coal, in large part, was natural gas. Now we need to solve that problem. That would be fine. But no, Mike Schellenberg seems to be cheering on natural gas. And then all this.
But that doesn't seem to me like that's going to be a big selling point for Trump supporters. Like, you know what? Let's make America have natural gas again. It's not really.
Well, it's not just that. It's like around harm reduction and crime and homelessness. Like he ran for governor of California. I mean, he seems to very much be a bit of a jumping from one thing to another thing.
Mm-hmm.
A very peripatetic figure. And it's an enormous embarrassment to the school of thought that is eco-modernism. One last thing that I wanted to say, and then I will shut up, is Matt Huber and I, and a number of other figures who are socialists, who are Marxists, are regularly called by the degrowthers eco-modernists. We're not, well, at least I'm not. I have a lot of sympathy for the research. I respect their research, but I'm just a plain vanilla socialist. Yeah. Like we were saying earlier, there's already more than enough within Marxism, classical Marxism, to explain why we are not decarbonizing fast enough, why there is a biodiversity loss crisis, why there's a plastic pollution crisis, and so on and so forth, why there is issues with antibiotic resistance, and historically lead pollution, and the ozone layer, and already within Marxism.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.